Not everyone who led America was allowed to return home in glory. Meriwether Lewis, one of the two leaders of the Great Lewis and Clark expedition, is proof of that truth. The man who helped draw the first borders of America in its frontier days died alone, in a shabby inn deep in the wilderness, with 2 gunshot wounds, and more than 200 years later, no one is certain whether he took his own life or was murdered. Lewis had once been a symbol of American daring and frontier idealism, a brilliant mind, completely trusted by President Thomas Jefferson, a keen naturalist and a bold warrior. But that very man, after returning from his legendary cross-continental journey, spiraled into self-doubt, depression, and nameless obsessions. And eventually, he vanished forever into the darkness of his own mind. What happened in Lewis's final years continues to puzzle historians. Glory brought him no peace. Instead, he faced vague accusations of financial misconduct, political isolation, a strained relationship with Jefferson's successor, James Madison, and poorly understood mental breakdowns. At one point, he was rumored to suffer from neurosyphilis, but other accounts claimed he was under the influence of forces we should not name somehow. Official history tried to gather his psychological fragments into a neat story of suicide. But the more one pores over old documents, his journals, friends' letters, and especially the accounts from Native Americans who saw Lewis when he returned to Tennessee, the harder it is to believe his death was just a personal choice. In the legends of some southern Native groups, Lewis was not a lonely man who ended his own life. They tell of a white man who crossed mountains and rivers, being hunted by invisible shadows. These shadows didn't come from the forest, but from the government, or from somewhere deeper and farther, a nameless power. Such rumors were initially dismissed as superstition, but when compared to the strange behavior of the authorities at the time, the rushed burial, the lack of an official investigation, and the years-long disappearance of crucial records, they begin to stir unease. What happened to Lewis after he returned from the Pacific Northwest? Did he carry with him a secret someone didn't want revealed? Could he have discovered something during his journey? About the land, the people, or something beyond normal understanding that became the reason he couldn't be allowed to live? The truth is, Lewis didn't die immediately from a single gunshot. According to the innkeeper at Grinder's Stand, the only known witness to his final hours, he was gasping, groaning, and calling out someone's name for hours before he passed. This raises a troubling question. Would someone trying to die shoot both head and chest and still survive for hours?
Ow.
In Lewis's will? Or rather, the scrap of paper thought to be a suicide note. There was no farewell to his beloved mother. Nothing addressed to Jefferson, just a few muddled, vague lines, in a style many handwriting analysts say does not match his. That document was once suspected to be forged, but was quickly filed away in the archives as part of a closed case. There is a tragic contrast. A man once able to lead an entire team across prairies, forests, mountains, and glaciers could no longer find a path for his own life. But was he truly lost? Or was he pushed off the road? The enemies Lewis may have had in government, the military, or post-Jefferson financial circles had reason enough to want his silence. But why? Could he have uncovered something during the expedition? Something Jefferson himself didn't he want future generations to know? Letters between the two men from the final months of Lewis's life were redacted in the National Archives, a detail that led many historians to wonder, did Lewis write something too sensitive, or was it simply a cry for help, that someone chose to ignore? There is one thing almost everyone overlooks when speaking of Meriwether Lewis. He was not just an explorer, but a man burdened by the weight of his era, a burden no one could have prepared for. Upon returning from his historic expedition with William Clark, he did not live in the glow of glory as many might imagine. On the contrary, his life entered a painful dislocation between public honor and private reality. Thomas Jefferson praised him as the most ideal American of his age. Yet after leaving the presidency, Jefferson himself seemed to fall silent in the face of his former protégé's growing distress. James Madison, his successor, showed little interest in Lewis, neither in financial support, nor in addressing the accusations against him regarding public spending in his role as governor of the Louisiana Territory. Lewis, who had survived starvation in the Rockies, now could not survive the maze of bureaucracy and political suspicion. One of the most perplexing aspects for scholars is how the federal government seemed to wash its hands of responsibility after his death. There was no official investigation, no trial, no proper autopsy. His body was hastily buried at the very place he died, Grinder's Stand, beside a deserted road in the Tennessee woods, rather than being returned to his home state of Virginia, as would be customary for someone who had served the nation at such a high level. The question arises, why the rush? Was there something that needed to be hidden or forgotten? In 1848, nearly 4 decades after Lewis's death, a group of local residents petitioned to exhume his remains to re-examine the wounds. According to them, Lewis's skull showed no typical signs of a suicide. Instead, there was a crack that appeared to have been caused by a blunt object. A special committee was formed, but its findings were never officially published. Some members of the committee later abruptly withdrew from public life. These details are not sufficient to prove a conspiracy, but far too many to be dismissed as coincidence. Meanwhile, folk legends tell a different story. Some say Lewis carried a notebook on his final journey, not for administrative records, but for things he could not write in the official journals of the expedition. A trader named Josiah Tanner once claimed to have seen this notebook, which contained hand-drawn maps that did not match the maps released by the government. There were symbols, red ink lines crossing unnamed territories, places where, according to Tanner, Lewis had written that an ancient civilization once existed here. Of course, no hard evidence supports this claim, and Tanner was mocked by the press of his time as a delusional man. But nearly a century later, an amateur archaeologist named Edgar Wallace, while surveying western Montana, discovered a stone tablet with strange carvings, matching the symbols Tanner had described, though not officially recognized. The find rekindled a question that has never been answered. Did Lewis discover something about North America's history? Something beyond the political and geographic frameworks the government was willing to admit? There is another theory few dare to speak aloud, that Lewis, who always carried notebooks, may have recorded disputes between Jefferson and the rising powers within the Madison administration. The quiet battles between two factions, one wishing to expand America according to the ideals of exploration, and the other preferring control, negotiation, and pragmatism, might have made Lewis a man who knew too much. In a letter to Jefferson, a few months before his death, he wrote a cryptic line, "You know better than any man that one should not carry the truth when he cannot protect himself from it." This line does not appear in any of the standard letter collections of the time. It exists only in a handwritten copy found in a small archive in Pennsylvania, discovered by an independent scholar. Many researchers believe the line was not written by Lewis, but the handwriting, tone, and context all match. If authentic, it could be the key to the entire case. Although William Clark, Lewis's companion and brother-in-arms, always spoke of him with respect, he never publicly questioned the death. In his later years, Clark wrote that Meriwether was overtaken by a darkness within himself, a phrasing that is polite yet chilling. Did Clark know more than he wrote? Or was he too forced into silence in an era where questioning the government could be dangerous? In any case, that silence has lasted far too long. And in silence, the rumors have grown, like a form of truth not yet allowed to be born. Lewis, the explorer, the idealist, the scientist, the soldier, died like a ghost in the very system he once served. There was no Medal of Honor, no state funeral, only a barren grave by the roadside, forgotten for nearly half a century until a group of young historians at the end of the 19th century rediscovered it. But all they found were remains, not answers. In 1925, more than a century after Meriwether Lewis's death, the U.S. Congress for the first time seriously debated recognizing his death as in the line of duty. A group of historians, veterans, and congressmen presented a case arguing that Lewis was not merely a victim of mental collapse, but a man sacrificed by the imperfections of a young national machinery. These words, spoken before the House of Representatives, startled many. But as in so many times before, the hearing ended in silence. No further action. No independent investigation. No decision to restore his honor. Nearly another century later, in 2009, Lewis's descendants and a group of historians once again petitioned to exhume his remains for modern forensic examination. They hoped that today's technology could provide evidence he had not taken his own life, but had been the victim of foul play. But the U.S. Department of the Interior refused. The official reason was concerns over the cultural and environmental consequences of exhumation. Once again, historical truth was withheld, not for lack of evidence, but behind layer upon layer of closed doors. If Meriwether Lewis died in darkness, then his very death has become a strange torch illuminating the still unhealed fractures in America's soul. From the pride of expansion to confusion over national identity, from revolutionary ideals to political doubt, Lewis was one of the earliest symbols of the American dream, yet in him, that dream ended like a blood-soaked delirium on the side of the road. There is a strange story about the oak tree that grew beside his grave. Locals in Tennessee believe the tree didn't grow by chance. It sprouted exactly where he fell, its roots digging into the buried part of history, as if the earth itself were trying to hold on to his spirit. That oak, according to records, was struck by lightning in 1933. The same year the United States emerged from the Great Depression for the first time. Mere coincidence, or a silent symbol history tried to leave behind? Some modern historians have come to view Lewis's case as a metaphor for America itself, a nation born from lofty ideals, yet often haunted by unnamed decisions, hidden forces, and unresolved inner conflicts. Lewis embodied the very question this country still hesitates to face. When a man lives for an ideal beyond his time, what price does he pay? Many have compared him to Hamlet, the prince of ideals and doubt in a court full of intrigue. But while Hamlet ultimately knew who his killer was, Lewis may have died never knowing who or what truly killed him. In the alleged suicide note, Lewis was said to have written, "I do not die of weakness, but because I cannot live in a world that denies what is right." This line has never been verified, but perhaps, like the man himself, it doesn't have to be entirely true to send chills down the spine. In 2023, a group of young artists retraced the Lewis and Clark journey in a documentary, but the focus was not on the lands they conquered. It ended at Grinder's Stand. They filmed the sunset falling over Lewis's grave, where only the wind whispered through the oaks. No music, no narration, just one line appearing on a black screen. There are some who do not die. They're merely forgotten between the pages of history no one dares to finish. Meriwether Lewis may not have been assassinated, or perhaps he was silenced. Maybe he was so desperate he shot himself twice. Or maybe he was never allowed to speak of what he truly knew. But one thing is certain. He deserves to be remembered, not just as an explorer, but as a symbol of the truths America still owes to itself. Truth is not always buried with the dead. Sometimes it lives on, waiting for someone brave enough to dig deeper. And perhaps on some quiet night along the Natchez Trace, one can still hear the sound of hooves tapping, a pen scratching paper, and the deep voice of a man who crossed a continent, could never cross the borders of what was meant to stay hidden.